Okay, leaving Latin America then and turning to the United States. Well, early in the 1700s, England and Scotland were united. What happened was when Queen Elizabeth I died, she had no children, so they asked her, who's going to take your place? And she said, well, who should it be but my cousin, the King of Scotland? So the King of Scotland then became the King of England. He ruled both countries separately, but eventually they joined together, England and Scotland. And by the way, it's been about less than 10 years ago, England and Scotland voted to remain part of England. Yes.
I have a question. So when she died, and they didn't know who, and she said, who else could be my
Her cousin. Yeah.
Well, I mean, she is deceased. So, in other words, was that determined beforehand? Like
it
was it already set?
It was determined
Right.
beforehand. Yeah, it was determined beforehand. There was no power struggle. When she died, the people of England called the King of Scotland to come down to London, and he was crowned the King of England also. But England and Scotland were still separate. He's called James the Sixth of Scotland, James the First of England, and James the Sixth had been King of Scotland by the time he was 1 year old. He was an adult by the time he became King of England. And ironically, Queen Elizabeth I had James's mother beheaded. And yet when she willed in her will that he, the son of the woman whom she had beheaded, would become the next king of Great Britain. Anyway, the two countries were united and became the country of Great Britain. Great Britain was ruled by Parliament. I remember learning as a child, we have Congress. Great Britain has Parliament. Parliament consists of two houses, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Now, eventually, the House of Lords got less and less and less power, and the House of Commons got more and more. Today, the House of Lords is a mere bunch of figureheads, just like the king itself. The people of England want to keep their nobility, and they want to keep their kings and queens. So I don't know what to do without them, because news about the royal family even becomes prominent news here in the United States. But news about Queen Elizabeth, you see her picture in the paper often, and some party she throws for one of her relatives makes news even here in the United States. Even more so over there. So again, I don't know what they would do without their kings and queens. But anyway, the king at this time we're talking about was George III. Keep him in mind because he's very important in American history. George III was to rule Britain for 60 years, but actually only ruled for 50. Then he became mentally incapable, and his son ruled as Prince Regent. But then George III had some physical problem. He had a disease that nobody even knew existed until the 20th. They thought the disease didn't exist until the 20th century. There was a movie made about him, some 25 years ago, which I did not see. But anyway, now, the 7 Years' War left Great Britain deeply, deeply into debt. And they said to the colonies, you need to help us pay the debt. The colonies were willing to share part of the load. But here is a problem. The colonies believed that they should not be taxed unless they had representatives in Parliament. Now, this is the standard view. Now, I listened to a man some time ago say that the real issue, the big issue, was not taxation so much as it was just basic fundamental rights. If you look at the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson, taxation is like number 16 on a list of grievances. And again, if you read the Declaration of Independence, and don't any of you write this way, but he begins every sentence is a one-sentence paragraph, and every paragraph begins with, he has done this, he has done that, he has done... All right, who was he? He was George III. They blamed the king for all the problems. Now here was the issue, folks. Really what I think the issue was. The people in the colonies believed that they should enjoy the same rights as the people in England did. The problem was it was highly expensive to enforce those rights over here. What they would often do was, if a person was accused of a crime in the colonies, they'd take that person from the colonies and take them to Great Britain for trial, where they had their lawyers over there. That was cheaper than transporting a judge and a couple of a defense attorney and a prosecuting attorney and transporting a bailiff and all that over here and then setting up a court over here. That was just too expensive. So they would take their people, take our people and transport there for trial. This was contrary to British law. British law said that a person had to be tried at his local district where that his own local people could witness. And the man who was taken to Britain for trial, those men frequently did not have any witnesses. Not everybody could afford the passage across the Atlantic. So that was one problem. Eventually, George III began to send governors over here, and that was another issue. He has imposed governors on us without our consent. He has imposed judges upon us without our consent and forced us to pay those judges out of our own coffers, etc., and etc. And again, the problem was, as the colonies became more and more rebellious, the king began to clamp down. The 13 colonies, each of the 13 colonies set up their own legislatures, which, if Britain would have recognized, perhaps the whole war might have been avoided. But also, the British sent their troops over here, supposedly to fight the Indians, since there were still some hostile Indians. And you might be going about your business one day, and all of a sudden a British officer knock on your door and say, "I have 2 men who don't have a place to stay. You keep them in your house." Ordering of troops in peacetime without the consent of the owner. This is expressly forbidden by our Constitution, but in those days, there was nothing the owner could do about it to keep those British soldiers, people, complete rank strangers. But no, there are numerous issues like this that came up. The hostilities between the colonies and the mother country grew bigger and bigger. Also, let's face it, the American colonial people were by this time richer than the people of Britain. And one of the reasons, and this was something British did not like, the American colonies quickly began issuing paper money. There was very little gold and silver in the colonies, but the colonies began issuing IOUs or banknotes or paper money. And this the colonial people would use as a medium of exchange. The British said, no, when you pay taxes, you have to pay in hard currency. And they resented the colonials paying in hard currency, but the problem was there just wasn't that much hard currency to go around. Now, the paper money was fought against, folk. The Chinese had used it, and then they quit using it in favor of gold and silver coins. But they could not have imagined, the chaos it would have been, supposing you get a place like Lockheed trying to pay 33,000 workers, and at one time Lockheed had that many, in gold and silver coins. It just simply terrible. And Lockheed once went 6 months without selling an airplane while I was there. Well, how did Lockheed pay its workers? Well, bank accounts. Simply, Lockheed had an account with a bank, so Lockheed would pay its workers, and the workers would go cash their paychecks, or actually would be direct deposited. But again, well, what if Lockheed had been unable to pay us for 6 months, and all of a sudden Lockheed sold about 6 planes at once, and then paid us all of us back pay for 6 months? The result would have been economic chaos. But anyway, they could not foresee this at the time, and a lot of people were against paper money, but the colonials were using it because they had to, and it was making them wealthier than the people of Britain were. The colonials said that the king and parliament cannot interfere with our local legislatures. Parliament insists, no, we rule over all the empire. The first conflict was an act called the Stamp Act. Now again, if you study American history, you'll run into this, but the Stamp Act said that all important papers, and that included property deeds, marriage licenses, all important papers had to have a stamp, and a stamp had to be paid for in silver coins. Well, the American colonials simply refused to pay it. They tarred and feathered. In other words, it was a miserable existence. A man who tried to collect the taxes was coated with a coat of tar, and then feathers put on a tar, and he would take, well, they didn't have solid cleaners. It would take him a long time to wash that stuff off. But he'd be miserable for a long time. But he was tarred and feathered. And I thought also they would not burn your house down if they disagreed with it. They'd go to your house and disassemble it, log by log, or board by board. Then you had the job of putting it back together again. This was their way of punishing people who sided with the king. People who sided with the king were called loyalists. People who were against the king were called Tories. Well, to make a long story short, and again, I could spend the entire day talking about the Revolutionary War, but we're going to rush through it. The British and colonials clashed at Lexington and Concord, and the war had begun. The British heard a rumor that there was munitions stored at Concord. On their way to Concord, they had to pass through Lexington. But the colonials had a lot of time on their hands since the port of Boston had been closed, and there was no work for them to do. So they were watching the British carefully. And two men, one named Paul Revere and one named William Dawes, went around warning colonials, the British are coming, the British are coming. The British met the colonials at Lexington. A shot was fired, and to this day nobody knows who fired that shot. It's called the shot heard around the world. Was it fired by the British? Was it fired by the colonials? When I was in the 8th grade, one of my classmates wrote a little story that he was the one who fired the shot, because he saw he was hunting and never found anything, and all of a sudden the rabbit jumped. He shot at the rabbit, and later learned that his shot was a shot heard around the world. He fired a shot, and the two sides then started shooting at each other. But anyway, it was a shot heard around the world, and we don't know who fired it. But anyway, the British won the initial fight at Lexington. They went on and marched to Concord, where the colonials removed all their ammunition and stuff they'd stored. The British found nothing. Then the British they first started marching back to Boston. But then as the colonials started shooting at it, the British wore bright red coats that made easy targets. The British started first to trot, then to run pell-mell back to Boston. There was a victory for the colonials. Well, several days later, they fought another fight at Breed's Hill, which is a fight known as the Battle of Bunker Hill. The battle was a British victory owing to the fact the colonials ran out of ammunition. But the British charged up the hill and were forced back. The British charged up the hill again and were forced back. When the British charged up the hill the third time, the colonials had no ammunition, so the colonials had to run. So it was a victory for the British, but it proved that the colonials could fight. Well, George Washington was made commander of the colonial army. He remained commander throughout the war, and as I hope all of you know, he eventually became president of the new nation. Now, in the meantime, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and I'm surprised at how many college students do not know that, but I want you to know that. There used to be a copy of the Declaration of Independence at our student center. I don't know if it's still there or not, but it has in big, bold letters, in Congress, July 4th, 1776. All right. Why do we celebrate the 4th of July? It's because the Declaration of Independence has that date on it. Now, they started debating. I mean, Thomas Jefferson wrote it on July 2nd. It was brought before the Congress on July 4th, and that's why it has that date on it. It was not ratified till August 2nd. Don't ask me why we don't celebrate August 2nd. Now, because July 4th occurs on the day that the class is scheduled to meet. We'll miss that day. Hopefully all of you saw on your syllabus. I know you're upset. Oh, July 4th. July 4th, 1776. But anyway, we'll hold a class on July 2nd. We'll hold another one on July 9th. We'll have a week off. All right, just keep that in mind, folks. Hopefully none of you will forget it. If you come here on July 4th, you'll find nobody here but cops and maintenance men. If you even find those. You'll find cops, but they'll be here. But anyway, That was the vote in which we declared that we were free from Great Britain. And anyway, oh yeah, and also in the Declaration, at the bottom there's a big, bold signature, John Hancock by name. John Hancock had heard that the King of England had an eyesight problem. He said the king won't need his spectacles to read this. So he wrote in big, bold letters, and from that little this was say, put your John Hancock here. But several men signed it, including Benjamin Franklin signed it, and two of Robert E. Lee's older brothers, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, Robert Morris. I mean, some of these names are famous, but it was signed and it was sent to the King of England. The King of England responded by sending more troops. Now, there was no good way that the colonials could have won that war, except before the war was over, Great Britain went to war with Spain. Spain would not side with us because they feared that a United States would someday take their territory, which we did. We took New Mexico. Before we took New Mexico, Mexico had already rebelled, but we took a lot of territory, and eventually we took Florida. But with all respect now, we paid for Florida. Spain sold Florida, so we paid for Florida. But Spain was afraid that the United States would want to expand and take over their territory, which to some extent did happen. So Spain, but there's an old saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So Spain became our friend. In addition, Russia was threatening war with Great Britain. Holland, or the Netherlands, was also threatening to go with war with Great Britain. Great Britain could not fight the colonials, could not fight Spain, and could not fight Russia all at once. But one nation that actually did go to war, finally, the French. The French had lost, and the French felt stung by it. So the French king, by this time Louis XVI, finally agreed to help the colonials, and the help from the French was greatly appreciated. Now, in the year 2000, when I started here, there was a movie that came out called The Patriot. And in the movie The Patriot, this man had killed a whole bunch of Frenchmen, and now here was another war. That was during the French Indian War, when it was war, so he killed a bunch of Frenchmen. Now all of a sudden he had a guilty conscience. He wanted these same French people whom he had just killed a few years before to come over and help us. And one line in the movie says, "The long-awaited help from the French finally arrived." Fine. Now, make a long story short, the British Army could not, they did not appreciate how huge the 13 colonies were. Great Britain is really a small island, but they didn't understand the distances that were involved, and also they learned they could not, if they stayed together, the colonials would act where they were not located. If they spread out, the colonials would defeat them piecemeal. But one day they spread out, and General Cornwallis went to Yorktown, and General Clinton was stayed in New York. Well, General Cornwallis found himself trapped in Yorktown, and here's where General Clinton, and no relation to Bill, but here's where he is blamed. General Clinton promised he'd help, that he'd come down and help, but he waited and waited and waited and waited and waited. And during that time, General Cornwallis was surrounded to the point where he could not leave. If General Cornwallis would have gotten away right away, he could have escaped. But he stayed there expecting Clinton to arrive. Clinton did not arrive in time. So Cornwallis found himself surrounded by 16,700 men, and mostly colonials, but a lot of French also. In the meantime, the French Navy had moved in and blocked the British ships from coming in. So the French Navy was out on the other side of Yorktown. On the seaside of Yorktown. Yorktown was a peninsula. So the French were right here, Navy. Then British and colonials were, French and colonials here. And the British were here, under Cornwallis. Now there were some British ships way out here, but they could not get in. Well, finally, General Cornwallis realized he was licked. He surrendered. And when he surrendered, part of the peace agreement was that he would leave, but leave all of his weaponry behind. So he left his cannon, and as the British Army marched toward the British ships that were allowed to come in, on a certain beat of the drum, all the British ships, all the British soldiers dropped their rifles at one time, made like a clang. Some of the British soldiers, it has been said, covered their faces to hide the fact that they were weeping. I mean, it's tough to lose a war, worse than losing a ball game. But, and it is said that the British drummers were playing "The World's Turned Upside Down," the British drumming fifers. But 5 days after Cornwallis left, General Clinton finally arrived. It has been said that General Clinton first heard a rumor, "We think that Cornwallis surrendered, sir. We're not sure we think." He traveled another day, and the next day he learned, "Yes, sir, Cornwallis actually surrendered." And the next day he learned, not only did Cornwallis surrender, but his entire army of 7,000 men have gone back to England. Well, when General Clinton arrived, he knew he didn't have enough men to fight the French and the colonials. So they stood and watched each other for a while, like they'd done for years. Washington did not want to fight because it would mean a whole lot of unnecessary killing, and he knew that Clinton knew he didn't have a chance to win. It took 2 years to work out the peace treaty. The peace treaty that ended the war was the Treaty of Paris, again. Now, there were two treaties of Paris, 1763, and the other one 20 years later in 1783. Both Treaty of Paris in 1763 ended the French and Indian War. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 ended the American Revolution. It has been said that sometimes winning the war is harder than keeping the peace after the war was over. For the first 10 years, a lot of colonials wished we were back under Great Britain. The government was called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation could not raise taxes, could not enforce treaties, could not raise an army. Basically, it was too weak to function. But a lot of persons thought it was too strong, even though it didn't have some basic powers that governments would do. The power was all with the states. Now, today we can hardly imagine that, but as recently as the 1860s, when the Civil War occurred, a lot of persons like Lee and Jackson felt loyalty to the state was more important than loyalty to the central government. And they fought in a confederacy because they were Southerners. Even though Jackson did not believe in slavery, but he was a Southerner. And Lee had really ambivalent views. So you can make a case that Lee did not believe in slavery. You can make a case that he did. Yes?
Did he have a relationship with black women?
You are thinking of Thomas Jefferson, I believe. Not Lee.
Oh, well,
Thomas Jefferson, now, he did, now, with all respect to Jefferson, let me say, the woman was actually half white, half black. She was a half sister to his wife. And when his wife died, Thomas Jefferson was faithful to his wife as long as she lived. And when his wife died, he had this thing, he was not allowed to marry her because she was looked on as being black. Yeah. Now, I say tongue-in-cheek, Thomas Jefferson is believed to have had one affair when he was over in France negotiating the Treaty of Paris. See, where the colonials sent him over to France to negotiate the Treaty of Paris, and that took a while. And so he was for some years without his wife. And he took Sally Heming along, but the French had outlawed slavery, so the French told him, this woman cannot be a slave with you here. So Thomas Jefferson had to officially turn her loose, but she stayed with him. Then she came back with him and resumed her life as a slave. But we recently, this was rumored, but we have checked the DNA of her name is Sally Heming. We've checked the DNA of her descendants, and yes, her descendants are carrying Thomas Jefferson's DNA. But there were 5 men living at the time nearby who also were carrying Thomas Jefferson's DNA. But we're pretty certain now, because we discovered a room that had been sealed up for decades, maybe more than a century, and the room was Sally Heming's room, and it was right next to Jeff. Okay, so much for that. But, this was, again, a lot of the people at that time lived that way. Some men are morally upright. But one man who wasn't was a man named Benjamin Franklin, but that's a different story. I'm not going to write his name down. When they've had their meetings, the girls knew who to tempt. And Benjamin Franklin was the one they could easily get. All right, that's enough of that. All right. Anyway, it has been said that the colonials did not really win the war. They just kept on fighting long enough to where the British finally got tired of fighting and found the fighting was too expensive. There is a whole lot of truth in that. But also a lot of Europe was turning against the British. Well, eventually the people got tired of the Articles. After 10 years under the Articles of Confederation, they set up a constitution. And under the Constitution, George Washington was elected president, and he's the only president that has been elected by every elector. Now, why do we have an electoral college? I believe I know the real reason. It's because the Knights Templar and the Masons had one. The Masons are offshoots from the Knights Templar. In the case of the Knights Templar, they came about after the Crusades, and they were going to build a perfect government. So they set up a system to where the leader would not be hereditary. Instead, the best of the people would pick some electors, and the electors then would choose the president. So basically the idea was only in the original constitution, only property owners could vote. So the property owners would elect legislators. The legislators then would choose electors, and the electors would choose the president. That's why we still have the Electoral College, even though the electors are not necessarily the most prominent people in the state. But nevertheless, that's where it comes from. That the best of people would elect the best of people, who would elect the best, who would in turn elect the leader. And the leader would be chosen only by the highest and most successful of your people. Now, again, today there is one large organization that does something very similar. The Catholic Church picks its popes by the cardinals. The cardinals will assemble in Rome, and St. Peter's in Rome, and they will ballot and ballot until they finally agree. 2/3 of them
That's
agree
what
on
they
the
did
pope.
with Francis.
What's that?
That's what they did with Francis, right? Or they,
What's that?
That's what they did with Pope Francis.
Oh, they've done it with all the popes for it's been more than 1,000 years. See,
Yeah.
there was a time when kings would pick the popes, but that practice has been outlawed.
Yeah, but that was like the one I actually like rewatched. It was like televised.
Oh, yeah. Well, the actual meeting, the actual vote, I believe, is still done in secret, super secret. And then what they do is, yeah, there's a lot of television that goes on, but then what they do is they send out a cloud of smoke. If it's a certain color, then they don't have a pope yet. If it's another color, they pick the pope. The pope is expected to be named, but basically it's only the higher ups get to choose. In the church's case, it's only the cardinals get to choose, and then the founders. Now, I say that the founders were all Masons. This is highly true. And if you look on the back of a dollar bill, you'll see an Egyptian pyramid with an eye on top, and the pyramid's top is detached from the rest of the pyramid. Let me see if I happen to have one. I mean, I don't use cash much anymore, but every once in a while, I'll still carry some. Let's see. All right, right here's one. This is a highly Masonic symbol, folks. It's the Great Pyramid of Egypt with the top detached, and inside the top is an eye, all-seeing eye. And out of one, what's that? Yes. Yes. All right, thank you. Folk, there are persons who attach all kinds of, okay, like I said, the Templars were supposed to form a perfect union. Eventually, that near perfect union they formed is the United States of America. No, this was the dream of the Templars, but they didn't get to see it. They couldn't do it in the old world. The old world was too steeped in the tradition of having a hereditary king and hereditary nobility. We have no hereditary nobility. And 100 years ago, there were 400 families that they said, given another 100 years, each foreign family own everything, every one of these families today is broken up and impoverished. Well, yeah, one of them was the Vanderbilts. Recently, a couple days ago, Vanderbilt woman died.
Mhm.
Yeah, some of you are aware of that. But the families that were supposed to control everything, mostly broken up, not completely impoverished perhaps, but mostly broken up.